7 months ago, my life took a sudden turn when my wife Emma, now my ex-wife, left me and our children for a high-paying job in another state. Emma is 42 years old, and I'm 44. We had been together for 12 years, married for 10, and we have 8-year-old twins. When she first told me about the job, it was a complete shock. I hadn't even known she was applying for positions. Apparently, she had done so without telling me, fully aware that I would never agree to move away, especially with everything happening in our lives at the time. We had been living in the same city as both our families, which was particularly important to me because a few years ago, my father was diagnosed with leukemia. His health had been fragile ever since, and we never knew when we might lose him. Being his only son, I felt an obligation to stay and support him and my mother. Emma knew this. She had been with me through the difficult times after his diagnosis, but over the last year or so, she had grown restless. She wanted to move, to seek out new opportunities and a fresh start, but I couldn't even consider leaving my father in such a state. Emma didn't see things the same way. She told me I was being too sensitive, that I couldn't keep turning down opportunities because of my dad's illness. She wanted me to understand that her career was important too, and that she was sacrificing for the sake of staying close to my family. But to me, it felt like she wasn't willing to see my side of things. I couldn't leave, not just because of my father but also because of my mother. If I left, she would have had to bear all the weight of caring for him alone. Even if I had siblings, I wouldn't have felt right leaving. It wasn't something my conscience would allow. This conflict had been brewing between us for over a year, with arguments becoming more frequent and more heated. Emma wanted out of our town, saying she felt trapped and needed change, while I was deeply rooted by my responsibilities. Then, earlier this year, she came home one day and dropped the bombshell. She had applied for a job out of state, and she got it. The position was a high-paying, upper management role at a company she had always admired. It was everything she had been dreaming of, and she was thrilled. But I wasn't. I remember sitting there, trying to absorb the news. My initial reaction was shock, then hurt, because she hadn't even told me about the job application. She had taken this huge step without involving me, without even asking for my opinion or support. I was stunned, but I managed to congratulate her, trying to suppress my feelings for the moment. We ended up arguing later that day because she could tell I wasn't genuinely happy for her. I wasn't trying to bring her down, but I just couldn't get past the fact that she hadn't included me in such a major decision. She told me she hadn't expected to get the job, but now that she had, she wanted to move, and she wanted me to come with her. She was asking me to uproot our entire family and leave everything behind, knowing how I felt about it. That led to one of the worst fights we'd ever had. It got so bad that Emma ended up leaving and staying with her parents for a few days. During that time, we didn't speak at all. I thought she was going to file for divorce right then and there. But when she came back, we decided to try and patch things up. We had kids, after all, and neither of us wanted to let them down. I still loved her, or at least I thought I did, and she said she loved me too, but she also didn't want to give up on her dreams. After a lot of discussion, we came to a compromise. She would take the job, and I would stay behind. We would try to make a long-distance marriage work. She promised to travel back as often as she could, and I reluctantly agreed. It wasn't ideal, but at that point, we didn't see any other options. For the sake of our children, and because we weren't ready to give up on each other just yet, we decided to give it a shot. For the next few months, Emma would come home every other weekend. But it wasn't the same. She would only be able to spend 2 days with us before flying back on Sunday evening for work on Monday. I knew it was exhausting for her, but I couldn't do anything to change the situation. Over time, I noticed a shift in her behavior. She seemed resentful, as if being with me and the kids was becoming more of a burden than a joy. Our phone calls became less frequent, and when we did talk, it always felt strained. Every conversation ended in an argument, and eventually, I stopped calling her altogether, waiting for her to reach out instead. But she rarely did. Things deteriorated quickly. The distance between us wasn't just physical anymore, it was emotional. When Emma came home one weekend after 4 months, she had divorce papers with her. I had seen the signs, but I wasn't prepared for how final it felt. We hadn't spoken for almost a week before that because of yet another argument, and when she handed me the papers, I realized I had nothing left to say. Our last fight had been the worst of all, with her openly suggesting that maybe we should separate for good. I should have known it was coming, especially since she had been spending more time with an old high school friend, Melissa. I had never liked Melissa. She had always been the kind of person who manipulated others for her own benefit. She had a history of getting involved with wealthy, married men, using them for their money without committing to anything serious. Emma and Melissa had drifted apart over the years, but when Emma moved for her job, they reconnected. Melissa lived in the same state, and she was the one who helped Emma settle in. I was there during the move, and I hoped that maybe Melissa had changed after all these years. But she hadn't. Melissa introduced Emma to a group of women who, like her, were single mothers living off child support from wealthy men. They had built a lifestyle around manipulating their situations to their advantage, and I could see that Emma was getting drawn into their circle. She told me about these women, how they had been supportive of her during her time away, but I couldn't help but feel like they were a bad influence. Emma started talking more about how unfair our situation was, and I could tell she was comparing herself to these women. By the time she handed me the divorce papers, it was clear that Emma didn't want to fight for our marriage anymore. She had made her choice, and I had no choice but to accept it. We signed the papers, and she left. It's been 7 months since then, and recently, she reached out to me. Things hadn't gone as she had planned in her new life, and she was struggling. She asked if she could come back. But after everything that happened, I'm not sure if there's anything left to salvage between us. They didn't want anyone to know about their affairs. Among the group of wives, it was quite common for them to claim they were involved in some sort of online business that, in reality, no one was particularly interested in. They wanted others to believe they were self-sufficient, running their own enterprises, but the truth was far from that. They were orchestrating scams and had the audacity to refer to themselves as independent women, reveling in the notion of living life on their own terms, all while depending financially on men who had unwittingly fallen into their traps. Emma found humor in their antics, but I found it repulsive. I was concerned about her associating with them, yet she continued to defend her friends. She insisted that, despite their questionable choices, she had come to know them personally and discovered that they were genuinely nice women. Given the multitude of issues already causing friction between us, I hesitated to escalate matters by confronting her about this. But everything changed during our last major argument before she filed for divorce. In the heat of that exchange, Emma expressed her admiration for Melissa, one of the women in that circle, claiming she was raising her 2 children admirably on her own without any man's help. I couldn't help but scoff at her words. I retorted that anyone making money through affairs with wealthy men would likely take care of their children, as those children represented a financial opportunity rather than a genuine bond. My comment ignited a massive fight between us. Up until that point, we had been trying to keep our tempers in check, but the mounting frustrations we had been harboring for months finally erupted. We hurled insults, revealing just how much we despised our situation and each other. At one point, Emma said if we were going to fight constantly, it would be better for us to separate. When she disconnected the call, I assumed she didn't mean it and thought she would reach out to apologize. But she never did. That week, she arrived with the divorce papers, and I agreed to go through with it. I couldn't find a reason to stay together anymore. We had both made efforts to salvage our relationship, but it had become clear that we were simply existing rather than living. Even for the sake of our children, whom we intended to keep together, we hardly spent time as a family. When we did, we were not happy. To prevent them from growing up in a toxic environment, we both agreed to divorce. The divorce process was surprisingly straightforward since there was no waiting period in our state. Dividing our joint assets was uncomplicated. I kept the house and the kids, as Emma did not wish to uproot them. She suggested we maintain our arrangement, where she would return every weekend to see them. We had been splitting their upbringing costs, and that continued as well. Once the kids were older, we planned to let them decide what they wanted. Although it was inconvenient for both of us, we didn't want to fight over custody. We both believed our kids deserved a relationship with both parents. Regarding the house, we agreed verbally to sell it in a few years, splitting the proceeds when the time came. A month passed after the divorce was finalized, and I assumed Emma wouldn't want to communicate with me afterward. Even during the divorce proceedings, our conversations revolved mainly around legal matters. Life felt like it hadn't changed much since we were still maintaining the same routine, but the fact remained that I was no longer married to Emma. My kids were understandably confused by the situation, so I had to explain to them that their mother and I were no longer together, even if our day-to-day lives felt largely unchanged. Then, one night, Emma called me, asking to sort things out between us and give our relationship another chance. She was hysterical, and it was evident that she had been crying. She ranted about how she had unintentionally glamorized the lifestyle of Melissa and her friends, which influenced her decision to file for divorce. She admitted she had kept this from me because she knew my feelings about Melissa. After our last fight, she spoke to her friends, who urged her to pursue the divorce. Initially skeptical, she ultimately succumbed to their pressure and consulted a lawyer. Now, a month after the divorce, she had attempted to move on, joining dating apps, going on blind dates, and hitting the nightlife, but all she found was emptiness. She felt pathetic, realizing that even in our tumultuous relationship, she had loved me and felt love in return. Now, all she felt was loneliness, exacerbated by the absence of her children. Her friends reassured her that this feeling would pass, but she couldn't shake off the guilt following the divorce. On top of her emotional turmoil, Emma's company, which had seemed promising when she joined, had undergone multiple rounds of pay cuts. It became clear that they had exaggerated their success to recruit her, and now her income fell short of what had been promised. This situation was common among her colleagues, leading her to believe the company was trying to keep its employees in the dark. Emma confessed that this instability also played a role in her desire to return to me. She expressed a longing for her family and the life we once had. After she recounted her situation, I was furious. I couldn't believe she had let her misguided friends sway her into filing for divorce. I had warned her about Melissa and made it clear I disapproved of the company she kept. It infuriated me that her poor choices were rooted in their influence. Had it been solely her mistake, I might have felt more sympathetic, but knowing that these were the same people I loathed added to my anger. The audacity of her calling me, crying about her loneliness, only served to amplify my frustration. I reminded her that she was no longer a teenager and that using her friends as a scapegoat for her poor decisions was unacceptable. This situation was entirely different from coming home drunk to her parents. It had impacted our lives and the kids' lives. Now, just because things were inconvenient for her, she wanted to reverse the divorce. I pointed out that this wasn't how things worked. Even if it were possible, I wasn't interested. I couldn't shake my anger over everything she had said. I suggested she turn to her friends for help, as they had encouraged her to pursue the divorce. If they truly cared for her, they would support her emotionally and financially. I was also deeply troubled by her admission of casually hooking up with random people since our separation. Although she was technically single, it made me feel uncomfortable and diminished what we had shared over the past 12 years. I firmly told her I no longer wanted her in my life, especially after hearing what she had just disclosed. I also indicated that I would ensure the kids stayed with me, questioning whether she was still a good influence on them. Emma burst into tears and insisted she was willing to do anything to make things right. I retorted that she had made her choice and had to live with it. The kids and I didn't need her anymore. With that, I ended the call and blocked her number. The next morning, I received several messages from my ex-in-laws, urging me to reconsider my words. They argued I shouldn't have said what I did, as Emma was already feeling low. They felt it was unkind of me to kick her when she was down, suggesting that I was punishing her for regretting her decision. I typically wouldn't care about their opinions, but they had been supportive of me after the divorce, leaving me conflicted about how to respond. As the days passed, I felt overwhelmed by my emotions and unsure of what to do. 4 days later, I had still not unblocked Emma, but the weekend was approaching, and she was scheduled to visit the kids. I dreaded seeing her again. Her parents had expressed disappointment in me, indicating that my harsh words had deeply affected her, leading to tears every time they called her. I had not responded to their messages because I didn't know how to address their concerns. When Emma finally arrived to pick up the kids, I could see the toll that the last few weeks had taken on her. It was difficult for me to maintain my anger when I saw her appearance. She asked if we could talk, and I reluctantly agreed after the kids went to their room. During our conversation, Emma expressed her sincere remorse, not just for the recent months but for the past couple of years, acknowledging her selfishness and the pain it had caused us. She admitted that after the divorce, each time she went out on a date or hooked up with someone, she realized that this wasn't the life she wanted. Instead, she felt guilty for throwing away everything we had built together. As she spoke, tears streamed down her face. I instinctively moved to comfort her, but she brushed it aside, saying that it would only deepen her shame, reminding her of the person she had treated me as. Listening to her reflections was bittersweet. I had wished for her acknowledgement of my worth when we were still together, but now I was left speechless. After a lengthy conversation, Emma revealed her decision to quit her job and move back so she could be closer to her family and our children. She recognized that it was not worth sacrificing time with them for a job that brought her little fulfillment. Her sole request was that I refrain from pursuing full custody, which I had.